Up to now, we've talked about state institutions being strong or weak, having capacity, or being corrupt, primarily in terms of the use of force. This week, we begin to focus on the role of the state in economic development. This video describes two categories of state that have emerged in developing countries, and it talks about them in terms of the economic relations that they promote. The gap between rich and poor countries may have widened in recent decades, but developing countries have always tried a variety of ways to bridge that gap. In the mid-20th century, countries generally tried two paths: import substitution industrialization, a strategy involving protecting domestic industries from international competition, and export-led growth, a strategy to promote domestic firms by helping them export to the global market. Export-led growth was adopted by countries like Japan and South Korea that successfully bridged the gap to become among the richest in the world. Economists have used this evidence to argue that strategies that promote trade rather than protectionism are better on their economic merits. Without getting into that debate, what we're going to talk about today is the underlying conditions that allowed Japan and South Korea to successfully promote that variety of industries into international markets. Peter Evans, in States and Industrial Transformation, describes the type of state institutions that promoted economic development in South Korea in particular. Noting that most definitions of the state focus on coercive power, he argues that modern states are more defined by their economic role. All modern states are involved in their economies, he says, and the question is not how much, but what kind. States that succeed at promoting economic growth are called developmental states and feature embeddedness and autonomy. Embeddedness means they have strong connections between state and society. This allows bureaucrats to know best which industries might have a competitive advantage, and it allows them to negotiate successfully among different economic actors. Autonomy means that the state is able to take a step back and think about its citizens' long-term goals, rather than simply represent the interests of different groups. Developmental states have Weberian bureaucracies full of highly skilled professionals organized into hierarchies, but they still interact with societal actors, people like NGO representatives, companies, labor organizations, at all levels of the bureaucracy. Developmental states are contrasted with predatory states, which allow leaders and their allies to use the state to advance their personal interests. Predatory states are defined by patron-client relationships. Individuals with access to power, such as members of a presidential clique, build networks of supporters by offering perks like jobs or exclusive contracts to those who are loyal to them. This environment fosters corruption rather than growth, since aid goes to companies with the closest ties to the leadership rather than those best able to compete in international or domestic markets. Predatory states often enforce their rule through oppression and are characterized by rent-seeking. So rent-seeking is not about landlords collecting rent. It is an economic term that refers to the practice of seeking profit by manipulating public policy or economic conditions instead of through open competition. Examples include companies or individuals lobbying for special tax breaks or lighter regulations. They could use bribes to obtain government contracts or use violence to force competitors out of a market, creating a monopoly. In sum, in predatory states, a small group of elites capture the state and use the bureaucracy to advance their interests. Just a few notes to conclude with. While predatory states are dictatorships, and developmental states are often associated with inclusive institutions, not all developmental states are democracies. South Korea did not hold free and fair elections until 1987, but pursued successful economic strategies before then. In addition, while South Korea is a model developmental state that pursued export-led growth, the two terms are not equivalent. Brazil was the model for import substitution, but as Evans notes, it also features characteristics of a developmental state. It was an intermediate case. Finally, just to note, you'll often see predatory states referred to as patrimonial or neo-patrimonial states as well. Those terms are equivalent. So those are the concepts that we're talking about this week. In class, we're going to discuss something implicit in Evans' argument, and that is to look more closely at what conditions allow for the creation of developmental states in the first place.